Hello and welcome again to another episode. My name is Brian Scott and I will be your host today. It's really hard in today's marketplace to go somewhere and not hear about or potentially even experience fraud. So that's why we've asked Karen Postma, who is Senior Vice President of Risk Solutions. Tell us, there's a lot of new things happening, unfortunately, in the fraud space. Tell us about some of those.
Over the last several years, we've put a lot of technology in place to help prevent fraud from, this third-party fraud person you picture sitting behind a computer screen, in the dark room doing all the fraud. And that's been hugely effective. Where we've seen the fraud shift is in two places. The fraudsters have started to, because they can't get through a lot of our defenses without a lot of pain, which is fantastic, is they've started to attack the consumer. And by that, I mean, there's a lot of scams. It'll look something to the effect of your credit union will call you and say, hey, I have a potential fraud situation. I'm going to send you an OTP in order to be able to talk to you. Well, on the back end, the fraudster has actually teed up a 3D secure transaction, and that OTP is actually for 3D secure, not necessarily, obviously, to talk to them. So there's a huge amount of scams. As I talk to credit unions all over, they're benchmarking scams and first-party fraud, which I'll also talk about, as about 70, maybe 50 to 70% of their entire fraud.
Wow.
So if you figure, then that's only 50 to 30% that is actually true third-party traditional fraud, and our consumers are being used against us.
Yeah. So fraud shifted dramatically.
Yeah, absolutely. And so has the way that the financial institutions have to address it, because there's a huge amount of education around scams. And I think probably every financial institution out there sends messages to say, don't give out your OTP and don't click on the link, right? But had I not shared that story with you and somebody called, you probably would have not even recognized the fact that you were being scammed, right? Because they play on the fear of what is happening. They time it so well. And you as a consumer aren't reading the actual text that says don't give out your OTP. You're just worried about getting them that OTP.
Right.
And so utilizing use cases in your education is highly imperative, especially for some of that older generation, using multimedia. So maybe it's honestly a TikTok video for some of the younger generation. Yeah. Or maybe it's a magnet that, your baby boomers put up on their fridge. And it says the same thing, but it's utilizing different mechanisms to be able to address it from a generational perspective.
Yeah. So you just mentioned first-party fraud. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So first-party fraud has always maybe been there a little bit, but during COVID and post-COVID, it continues to expand greatly. And it's true. It could be a multitude of things. It could be, hey, I had at one time loaded my card into my son's Xbox and I didn't necessarily give him permission. And so I'm going to report it fraud because I didn't know that transaction was happening. That's an unintentional fraud report. That happens. However, what we're seeing is a huge increase of an intentional first-party fraud where because of the shift of transactions from card present to card not present, it is much easier for people to feel okay doing first-party fraud and reporting it fraud. In fact, there's a statistic that says about a quarter of people feel like first-party fraud is actually okay, and over 20% of people have actually admitted to committing first-party fraud. And those are the people that are admitting it, saying that. So it's a huge problem. We're also seeing first-party fraud in the card-present space. But what is actually a fantastic thing is the technology we have today for chip-enabled transactions. We today have not had a counterfeit card-present chip, fully authenticated chip transaction.
Wow, that's good.
It is good. It's absolutely great. And it also gives us a tool to be able to understand when some first-party fraud might be happening. So if the consumer is reporting fraud and says they still have their card, but the fraud they're reporting is fully authenticated chip or tap and go chip, it is not fraud. And so having these investigative teams and the data to be able to do these investigations up front before you go through any recovery process is highly imperative. Because if you can imagine taking off even 30% of your volume and holding the consumer liable, now it might end up in your collections area, but it's a different liability component than if it's fraud.
Wow. So I hate to ask this, but are there new trends that are kind of inkling out there, little small things that you think might become the next big thing?
Yeah, I mean, the fraudsters are being so successful with the scams. I really think it's kind of an expansion of that. What we are looking at doing and have highly encouraged our financial institutions to do is, the old adage of authentication of something you are, something you have, and something you know, is to expand that methodology to something you are, something you have, something you know, and the utilization of data. We have so much data, whether it's coming from a third party or internally, to be able to put together actual stories about what actually happened, and being able to hold people accountable for transactions that they have, to put in place components of, if you have so many reported fraud that isn't fraud in a specific period of time, maybe you revoke their card or something to that effect. Because if you don't, so what we're seeing is for credit unions and banks that have not put these practices in place, I'm going to tell you, my friend, that I can do this, but I'm telling my family member. And so the problem's only going to get worse.
Yeah. It's a tough balance, trying to balance the member experience and preventing fraud. And sometimes those don't go well together.
You're right. They absolutely do. We talk about that little bit of friction that helps, but when it's your member, your consumer that is actually causing the fraudulent transactions, it does make it a little bit more difficult. But there's a lot of great tools out there, such as, biometric authentication, and some of those that I really feel like the process of OTP is on the way out, where we can use some of these other tools so that the fraudsters maybe don't have the opportunity to ask for the OTP and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here. I'm hesitant to invite you back because every time you come back, you've got more bad news about fraud. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate it. And thank you all for watching. We will be back with more great episodes coming soon.